The world is confusing. Lots of people are putting all of their mental energy into figuring out what's really going on. And thanks to those intellectual warriors, we have ideas like this.
Have you ever wondered how The Simpsons can predict the future?
And could it be that we are living beneath a cosmic ocean, shielded by a mysterious dome?
Actually, in 2018, Joe Biden died. He passed away from eating 15 hot dogs at Six Flags.
Well, a lot of this stuff does sound insane. It's not that much crazier than a cabal of billionaires and real estate investors gathering together to use their wealth and power to try to defeat a democratically elected mayoral candidate who ran on a radical platform of free buses and rent control.
On June 24th, let's get some more free transit.
I think a lot of us are inadvertently ignoring why we should be taking conspiracy theories more seriously. But when we laugh at folks who believe that the Titanic didn't really sink but was swapped out for another ship for an insurance scam, we're ignoring the much more important truth at the heart of the current wave of conspiracy. And understanding this truth reveals something more insidious about our cultural and political ecosystem, something that's making it harder for all of us to do anything about this crap world that we live in.
Everything is fucked up right now. No one's got job, everybody found out about racism, and disease be going bad.
To put it really simply, everybody knows that things are screwed up, but we struggle to make sense of precisely why that is, which makes it feel impossible to do anything about it, so we end up trapped in a cycle of anger and despair. Even when we can identify the bad system, we struggle to understand why anyone allows this stuff to keep happening.
Somebody has to do something.
As Celine Wen writes in an essay about contemporary conspiracy, the prevalence of conspiracy theories reflects a nearly ubiquitous feeling of disenfranchisement and despair. Both left-wing and right-wing paranoics recognize that they can't control their material conditions, but they can at least control the story they tell about them.
We're targeting younger people and middle-aged people who are living in despair.
So rather than changing the world, we're caught competing to see who can tell the more convincing story about why the world is the way it is. It's a little bit like having diarrhea, and then rather than being able to stop the diarrhea, you come up with an increasingly elaborate narrative about how bad Chipotle guac did this to you. Now, luckily for us, contemporary philosophy has a lot to say about this phenomenon. Conspiracy theory, not burrito-based incontinence. Now, in a recent video, I talked about the late Frederic Jameson, who argues that the cultural logic of late capitalism, what he calls postmodernism, produces a set of conditions in which we don't have any overarching theory that explains how economic, political, and cultural structures are connected. As he sees it, capitalism destroys our ability to think historically. So rather than seeing a line of historical and social connectivity, we're caught in a pure present, constantly focused on the new thing. And this lack of an overarching or totalizing theory creates conditions that are perfect for the growth of conspiracy theories. Jameson writes that conspiracy theory and its garish narrative manifestations must be seen as a degraded attempt to think the impossible totality of the contemporary world system. In other words, conspiracy theory is a crappy version of the thing we should be doing, namely trying to think about the actual structures of the systems shaping our world and our lives. Capitalism. So the conspiracy theorists are right, just in the wrong way. But they're ultimately attempting to do something that we should all be doing. I'll talk more about this later, but this is all made especially difficult by the fact that capitalism is structured in such a way that it's incredibly hard to pin down. And it's hard to see a totalizing structure when it's constantly shifting around and hiding itself from you. To use an analogy, trying to think about capitalism as a totalizing structure from within capitalism, sort of like trying to get out of a corn maze while you're on LSD. This is something one of my favorite filmmakers, Adam Curtis, gets into in his recent documentary series, Shifty. Now, in it, Curtis explores the way in which the rise of neoliberal policy and the culture of individualism in the late 20th century created a world without any sort of shared reality. Now, if you haven't seen Curtis' work before, it might be because his films are exclusively available on BBC iPlayer, which sadly you can only access if you are in the UK, which would be devastating if it wasn't for this video's sponsor, Surfshark VPN. Now, Surfshark allows me to tell the internet that I am, in fact, currently browsing from my flat outside of London, which then gives me access to BBC iPlayer, so then I can binge Adam Curtis documentaries and bask in the horrors of late capitalism. Using Surfshark opens up a whole new world of shows, films, and documentaries by letting you virtually travel around the world. And it makes this virtual travel safe with increased security and privacy, which then allows you to keep your online activity encrypted whether you're at home or using your laptop on public Wi-Fi at a coffee shop. Now, Surfshark has 3,200 servers in 100 countries, so when I'm using it, it's like having a global passport to safely explore the internet. And because the internet can sometimes feel like living inside of a conspiracy film, I'm also loving Surfshark Antivirus, which works 24/7 to make sure creeps aren't accessing my webcam to try to catch me with my hat off. So if you want to watch dystopian British documentaries, no matter where you are in the world, check out Surfshark VPN. You go to surfshark.com/burns or use my code BURNS. You'll get 4 extra months for free. And there's no risk in trying out Surfshark as they offer a 30-day money-back guarantee. So use my code and sign up for Surfshark today. And once you sign up, go watch Shifty by Adam Curtis because it overlaps with the themes of this video. But it's not just British filmmakers who are able to capture the dystopian era of conspiracy that we find ourselves in, as there is a young American filmmaker who's been able to capture the inner psyches of modern American conspiracists with stunning clarity. Connor O'Malley.
I'm the human version of Israel, surrounded by enemies and constantly under attack. But things are finally starting to go my way with the election of Donald J. Trump. It's like 9/11 never happened, but Iraq and Afghanistan did. Everything's gonna be fixed. I'm gonna make 5 figures a year. I'm gonna get a wife, and I'm gonna eat chops this thick.
I'm serious, this guy is a genius, and I'm gonna show you how in a second. So today, I'm going to explain the underlying philosophy and psychology of modern conspiracy theory, and I'm gonna show you how we're not only getting it wrong, we're getting it wrong in a way that is benefiting those in power. Okay, so let's start with the definition of conspiracy theory that we can all agree upon, It's an explanation for an event or system which locates the nefarious motives of a secretive group at the heart of that event, often with an explicitly political motivation. And these theories usually offer a way more complex explanation than a more common sense understanding.
Basically, there's rumors speculating online that the Chinese government, you know about Gaia Force?
No. What if I told you this was actually a documentary?
The Chinese government figured out how to hack into the Gaia Force, and they are changing the course of the world for power.
It's like how moon landing conspiracists argue that rather than being an achievement of the space program, that the moon landing was a staged television event that just served the ideological purpose of allowing the United States to seem like they were beating the Soviet Union in the space race. Also, say what you will about the Soviet Union, but they did put a woman in space way before we did. But what's more important than this is understanding what the conspiracy theorist is doing when they develop, perpetuate, or just believe in these theories. Okay, so let's talk about what it is that they're doing. The conspiracy theorist develops oversimplified and often paranoid narratives that explain mysterious and unknowable dynamics of economic and political power. Their underlying belief is that there is a coherent and well-ordered world hidden beneath the surface, but that world is obscured and hidden by a cabal of evil elites. And it seems like for many of these conspiracists, there's a belief that exposing those evil elites will undermine and even destroy their power. One way to think about this is that the conspiracist takes the problem of why and replaces it with a what, which means that rather than really analyzing the cause of the phenomenon, they get hung up on a what or a who that's doing the thing. And this just leaves them with a shortcut where they get to say this person or this group of people are doing a thing rather than understanding the systems and structures at play. Basically, if the problem is just some guys doing some stuff, you convince yourself that the solution is also some guys doing some stuff. So instead of focusing on a structure that demands corruption in the name of profit, a party whose leadership continues to serve the interest of Wall Street and billionaire donors, the conspiracist constructs a narrative in which the Democratic Party is actually a PDF file type of cult that uses the blood of children to fuel their satanic orgies.
Biden's a child molester, and he kidnaps children and does horrible things to them, just like Hillary Clinton and Obama, who made the virus.
Okay, to better understand this, let's talk about the Scorsese of guys who went bankrupt because of OnlyFans Connor O'Malley. One of his recent videos, Pipe Rock Theory, is a masterpiece of social satire. It follows a young man named Kevin Podcast who's trying to uncover the truth behind the pipe rocks he's discovered at his local park. Like all modern conspiracists, Kevin starts out on a podcast with one of his bros. And when he's trying to solve one conspiracy, he runs into a couple of guys that are trying to solve another conspiracy.
What are you doing here?
What?
What are you doing here? Hey.
And it's interesting that after they realize Kevin is right, they quickly unify and join forces because the conspiracist psychologically seems always ready to get on board with the next conspiracy or the bigger and better conspiracy.
Listen to me! Listen to me!
We need to stop this shit.
Now soon, their investigation about pipe rocks leads them to a mansion in North Hollywood where Tom Cruise is leading the charge. And here we get our cabal of elites. We get Joe Biden, Bono, and Netflix's own Barack Obama. And I'm sure you can see where this is going. Eventually, Santa Claus shows up because the North Pole Defense Force is working with Tom Cruise and the Church of Scientology.
This is the North Pole Defense Team. I'm Santa Claus.
And eventually, Kevin Podcast is given the Presidential Medal of Podcast Informativeness by Donald Trump.
Nobody's ever done it like him. He's a warrior in every way, and we appreciate you being here.
Again, showing that these days, there's a pretty clear line from conspiracy podcast to White House.
I want to thank the Nelt Boys, Aiden Ross, Theo Vaughn, Bustin' with the Boys, and last but not least, the mighty and powerful Joe Rogan.
And one thing that's interesting is that because Kevin ends up being right at every step of the way, we get to see the full reality of what the conspiracist actually believes to be true. Of course, pipe rocks suck up the energy of children and funnel them to a house in North Hollywood where Tom Cruise, Joe Biden, Barack Obama, and Protestant singer Bono are all hanging out. And it's also important to note, Kevin Podcast isn't a bad guy. For Christ's sake, he's making an album of non-PDF file R. Kelly covers.
I believe I can fly.
Something the world really wants. But Kevin is clearly seeking a totalizing explanation for all the weird aspects of society. He's a seemingly downwardly mobile white guy who knows that some external system is making his life suck, and he thinks that he has the ability to uncover what's really going on.
Inside of the rocks, there's pipes making all these sounds. I'm feeling like so tired by this rock.
And dude, what is the opposite of a rock? Pipes. And it's like, why are they putting them together? This is unnatural.
But these days, conspiracy theory isn't just attractive to the Kevin Podcast of the world. The yoga moms and the Christian bros and the Pornhub power users are all getting in on the action. Let me know which one you are. If you had to identify as either a yoga mom, a Christian bro, or a Pornhub power user, let me know who you are. I would guess that if we took a vote, 70% of you would be Pornhub power users, 25% would be Christian bros, and 5 would be yoga moms. Now, that's because an increasingly chaotic social and economic reality is making it harder for all types of folks to understand what's going on and figure out what they can do to make things better. We're constantly sold solutions to all the ongoing crises and problems by big boy leaders in politics and tech, but nothing seems to be getting any better.
You would prefer the human race to endure, right? You're hesitating.
Yeah, well,
Yes?
I don't know.
I mean, guys, we are approaching the 20-year anniversary of the 2008 financial crash and the Occupy movement, and we're still just here. So when official narratives don't help you make sense of the world, you might be tempted to fall for some pretty weird shit. Now, in her recent book, Doppelganger, Naomi Klein gets into this and writes that conspiracy theorists get the facts wrong, but often get the feelings right, meaning that they're right to feel like the world doesn't make sense. Like nefarious forces are making life increasingly hard for normal people, but they get the facts wrong when they rely on overly complex and conspiratorial narratives to make sense of things. She explores this in the book by contesting her own work, which is famously critical of neoliberalism and capitalism, with her doppelganger, Naomi Wolf, whose own political skepticism led her to go full-on conspiracy theorist in recent years. They're both Naomis using research and writing to try to make sense of the world, and while Klein locates the root problem in neoliberal capitalism, Wolf sees it in 5G, COVID vaccines, things of that nature. Now, in a recent essay on Frederic Jameson, philosopher Frank Ruda comes to some similar conclusions about the reasonable side of conspiracy theories. He writes that conspiracy theories are problematic manifestations of a rational demand, a demand of reason. This demand is a demand for orientation in a world that no longer allows for any, since the constitutive principles of its organization have become obscured. Ironically, conspiracy theories are the wrong form of doing the right and necessary thing. Similar to Klein's argument, Ruda thinks that the conspiracist is doing the right thing in the wrong way. And that right thing is demanding a rational explanation for why the world is the way it is. One that relies on reason rather than paranoia or fantasy. Now, in this way, the conspiracist starts from a philosophical point of view. They're skeptical of dominant narratives in society, and they want to uncover the truth of the system, to leave the cave, so to speak. But they fail to go about this process by using a critical and philosophical method. To stick with Plato's analogy of the cave, rather than leaving the cave, these folks are enticed by even weirder and more enticing shadows on the walls. In other words, rather than passing through an ordeal that reorients their understanding, they're exchanging the main set of shadows and ideological constructs for another weirder set of shadows. But they're still just trapped in a cave of representations. Now, at this point, some of you might be thinking, is being a conspiracy theorist really that different from being a leftist who sees capitalism as the evil force behind every bad and exploitative social phenomena? Is Kevin Podcast really that different from your friend that read Marx and Adorno in grad school and hasn't shut up about it for 15 years?
You've done the reading, we talked about it. What more do you expect from a reading group?
Well, according to French philosopher and anthropologist Bruno Latour, conspiracy and critical theory actually have a lot in common. He writes that in both cases, you have to learn to become suspicious of everything people say because they live in the thralls of a complete illusion. Then, after disbelief is struck and an explanation is requested for what is really going on, in both cases, again, it is the same appeal to powerful agents hidden in the dark, acting always consistently, continuously, relentlessly. So as he sees it, both types of theorists encourage us to look beneath the surface to see what's really going on. The only difference is that one group listens to TrueAnon and the other group listens to Joe Rogan. But according to philosopher Elek Zupančič, this critique doesn't hold, as it too quickly conflates what critical theory does with how conspiracy theory operates. Now, she writes that, however, while critical theory examines the means and ways in which, for instance, the manufacturing of consent takes place, a conspiracy theory immediately jumps to what is behind, to hidden depths, to another reality. It never really deals with critical analysis of facts and of reality in their inner structure. Again, we can see the analogy with Plato's cave right here. It's not that the conspiracist leaves the cave for a higher form of critical understanding. They just get caught up in another set of representations. So when conspiracy theory jumps to a compelling narrative that explains some aspect of reality, it doesn't actually analyze how we get there. Again, I talked about this before. They're more interested in a what than a why. Think back to pipe rock theory, right? It's always a person online, and then a thing that you find, and then it's Tom Cruise, and then it's Protestant singer Bono, and then it's Santa Claus. There's always these what's behind everything, and not a structure or a system that explains it. And this is all in opposition to critical theory, or philosophical thought more generally, which works to understand the logical structures at the core of a given event or phenomena. Zupančič goes on to write that the basic assumption of any critical theory worthy of its name is that precisely as false, these facts are extremely relevant for the analysis and have to be taken and examined seriously. So even if the conspiracist gets caught up on a particular what, we can still ask why and take that why pretty seriously. Now, I wanted to take that little detour as I think it is important to make clear that taking a critical and philosophical approach to society is distinct from conspiracy theory. I think sometimes these positions get way too close. There's folks on the internet especially who will use and I think abuse philosophical language to appeal to a conspiratorial urge. And it's not good. I don't like it. That's that shit I don't like. Okay, I think now we better understand precisely what the conspiracist is doing but we can still ask, what can we learn from this? Okay, so let's get back to Frederic Jameson, who shows us not only what the conspiracist is trying to do, but argues that in a sense, it's what we should all be trying to do. Also, a reminder, if you're interested in Frederic Jameson, I am running a book club on his work over on my Patreon. It just started up, so you can definitely catch up. There's a link in the description. I would love to have you. Now, according to Jameson, conspiracy is the poor person's cognitive mapping in the postmodern age. It is the degraded figure of the total logic of late capital, a desperate attempt to represent the latter's system whose failure is marked by its slippage into sheer theme and content. Now, cognitive mapping describes a spatial analysis that shows the totality of class relations on a global scale. Jameson thinks the ability to cognitively map is an integral part of any socialist political project, and that the inability to carry out this project of mapping can be crippling to political experience. And we see this inability in the conspiracy-fueled characters in O'Malley's videos, where the lack of an ability to actually see class relations leads to this.
Chug it, chug it, chug it.
Little hot sauce.
Yeah. So in response to this culture of postmodern spectacle and Windex chugging, Jameson thinks we need to reinvent an aesthetic of cognitive mapping, a pedagogical political culture which seeks to endow the individual subject with some new heightened sense of its place in the global system. Basically, it's a way of understanding ourselves not as atomized individuals, but as part of a larger structure. And again, I said this earlier in the video, one of the main points here is that the conspiracist over-relies on individual analysis and isn't able to think in structural terms. But like a pirate trying to keep you from finding his treasure, capitalism reproduces itself in a way that is intentionally disorienting. According to Ruda, it de-skills all of us with regard to our cognitive mapping abilities. Now, he writes that insisting on the possibility of a cognitive map in times of its impossibility, in times in which the very idea of a map of global capitalism has been invalidated by the tectonic shifts in its political economy, meant for Jameson to defend the idea that despite its apparent complexity and seeming irrepresentability, a new orientation can be achieved. I know that one was a lot. Jameson Book Club could do that. I'm just saying. So as he reads Jameson, the seeming impossibility of a contemporary cognitive map shouldn't stop us from trying to find a new orientation from which we can see what's truly going on and then try to figure out how to act accordingly. One thing we can take from all of this is that by focusing too much of our energy on critiquing the individual actions of conspiracists, we don't get any closer to understanding the systemic issues that lead to conspiracism in the first place. This is why Naomi Klein thinks that the conspiracist is just focusing on the wrong C word. Share your favorite C words in the comments. She writes that the word for the system driving those feelings starts with C, but if no one ever taught you how capitalism works, then it's easy to see how you might confuse it with another C word. Conspiracy. Now, Klein also notes that there's a parallel between the conspiracist and the neoliberal because they both see the world primarily through the lens of individual actions and not systems of economic and political power. While the conspiracist might think that George Soros is the only one who's making life bad, the neoliberal might think that Kamala Harris or Mayor Pete is the only one that can fix it. But when we shift our focus to the more useful C word, capitalism, we're able to see that financial crises, energy shortages, and wars are being manipulated by the powerful in ways that harm society. According to Klein, this does not make you a conspiracy theorist, it makes you a serious observer of politics and history. Jameson and Klein both believe that the antidote to conspiracy isn't just debunking or fact-checking. It's analyzing society such that we can see how power functions under the capitalist system. So does this mean the Kevin podcast needs to go into debt getting a master's degree in critical theory? Not necessarily. But a mistake that conspiracy theorists like Kevin often make is focusing on the weirdness of individuals to the extent that it makes them unable to criticize systems. This is why for Jameson and other philosophers inspired by Marx's dialectical method, Marxism offers a logical system that can explain the otherwise mysterious forces that dominate modern society. Even if you are skeptical of Marxism, hopefully you can at least see how a logical system like this allows us to analyze systems of power without devolving into conspiracy. And because capitalism works so hard to make itself unknowable, we can't really blame the Kevin podcast of the world for their various pipe rock theories, as they're living in a system that hides its own structure while working to marginalize perspectives that give us a totalizing critique. It's sort of like how the most power-hungry totalitarian monsters in society are the ones fighting to make sure that things like Marxism and critical theory aren't allowed to be taught at schools and universities anymore. As God forbid, we're able to make a cognitive map of our society.
Also, hopefully parents are rethinking even the idea of dropping their kids off at a public school.
This is why Ruta says that the system intentionally de-skills us from being able to carry out this sort of analysis. They don't want you to think. This is real, Maybe this is me being conspiratorial. But they don't want us to think, and they don't want us to have the critical tools to think, because then we could see the bullshit, guys. They don't want us to see the bullshit. Okay, this might be a hot take, but I think that this all means we should be way more empathetic to some of the folks who are falling for these batshit crazy conspiracy theories. Or, as Nguyen writes, we might need to approach conspiracy theories empathetically, as a reflection of someone's political anxieties and fears. And we can save our ruthless critical energy for the folks in power who are exploiting the folks who fall for conspiracies, and then just use that to continue building their own power. And this is why Zupančič argues that the real conspiracy theorists that we need to worry about are the elites running society. They know that the planet is dying and that the economy is unsustainable, but they keep pushing forward a false narrative that promises to hold it all together, even as we're just standing around watching it all fall apart. Klein makes a similar point, arguing that our liberal democratic societies are characterized by unmasked plutocracy. There's no secret to reveal. Instead of the Illuminati, we have the attendees of the annual Davos conference, where the politicians and capitalists most responsible for climate change and capitalist extraction pretend to be our heroes, solving the world's hardest problems for the greater good. Our world might be more corrupt than the conspiracy theorists realize. In an essay on Klein's book, Nico Baumbach writes that anti-establishment politics, without a critique of capitalism or some guiding egalitarian principle, accounts for the lure of Trumpism and conspiracism, and will remain seductive as long as mainstream liberalism takes the side of the establishment in response, and there is no readily available left alternative. And a lot of us might think of ourselves as too smart for conspiracies or too clever to fall for this sort of stuff. But Zupančič points out that too can be a bit of a risk. She brings this up via an anecdote that's been used by Slavoj Žižek. It's about a man who tragically loses his wife, but he seems oddly calm when he talks about her to his friends, as long as he's holding his pet hamster. But after a couple of years, that hamster dies, and then he absolutely loses it. He's overwhelmed by the trauma of losing his wife. In psychoanalytic terms, the hamster was this object that he could focus on to keep him from the tragedy and trauma of reality. Zupančič brings up this anecdote in the context of conspiracy theory to argue that it is the knowledge itself that is our hamster today, enabling us to supposedly accept the reality that this knowledge refers to. And when she says knowledge here, she basically just means our knowledge of how things really are, our clever analysis of what the world is really like. And as she sees it, we end up being more concerned with being correct and not being deceived than we are with fully acknowledging the traumatic aspects of our reality.
Everybody's sitting around not doing fucking shit, and meanwhile the markets are in turmoil. That's why I come down here, Wall Street, and I'm handing out free homemade Powerade to all the stockbrokers.
So we might feel good about ourselves because, of course, we know the Protestant singer Bono isn't part of a satanic cult with Netflix Obama. And we, of course, know that actually it's capitalism that's making things so bad. And, we read the right books and we watch the right YouTube videos and all that. But maybe so what? If that knowledge is just the hamster that we hold on to avoid facing the trauma of reality, then maybe we're kind of just helping maintain the status quo and helping ourselves stop from freaking out. To put this a little bit differently, if knowledge isn't facilitating action, then it might just be a useful narrative, not that different from that of the conspiracists. Calling things fascist doesn't stop fascism. Describing the horrors of capitalism doesn't make the system scared. To risk idealism here We don't want to understand the system to understand the system. We want to understand the system to figure out how to change the world. And if you want to think more about this stuff, please do come join me over on Patreon, where we have a Frederic Jameson reading group. And thanks so much to all of the patrons. In my last video, I mentioned that my goal is to get to 2,000 paid patrons by the end of this year to make this channel and my team in this community a sustainable thing. And whoa, you guys showed up. We're getting close. We already doubled the numbers. So I really appreciate that. There's a link in the description. You can head over there if you want. And just a reminder, I stream every Wednesday, noon Pacific time from this channel. I always post the unlisted link on Patreon. And if you're not already subscribed to my second channel, Sideburns, it's where I'm posting clips from streams, shorter stuff, reaction things, stuff that's a little more fun. You can go subscribe to that. I would appreciate it. In the meantime, remember that the opposite of a rock is pipes.